Welcome everyone to a masterclass on adaptation with Dan Levinthal. He has generously offered. This is our first such webinar, and so we're very excited and appreciate his participation. I'd like to offer a welcome from the entire leadership of the SMS Behavioral Strategy IG group. Just a few items to draw your attention to. This is just one of many opportunities to engage with the IG. Earlier this year, we hosted a workshop led by Nikolai Foss and participation by many of our members. This, of course, is our first webinar for the spring. I encourage everyone to visit us in Istanbul coming up this fall. We'll have another webinar, in fact, later in the fall as well. So watch out information on that. You can go to YouTube, you can go to LinkedIn, #behavioral strategy for more information and dates. Okay, so for today's subject, adaptation, when we were putting the program together for this year, we were thinking about what topics would make the most sense. I think we all, meaning the entire leadership, sort of settled on adaptation. Since we sort of commonly agreed that strategic management is about adaptation. In fact, my old colleague Will Mitchell, when I was at Duke, would often say, "Well, that's what strategy is about." So we thought this was a good subject to sort of kick us off with some rough definitions here. How do organizations change in response to the external environment? How does organizational change influence performance? So the question of how should we think about and study adaptation today is the subject of our webinar, and I will turn it over to one of our leadership members, Maciek Workowicz, to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, John, and welcome everyone. My name is Maciej Workowicz, and I'm an associate professor at ESSEC Business Schools in France. And today I will be playing a role of a host and managing the Q&A session at the end. So please share your questions in the Q&A tab or chat, and I will curate the list and manage the interactions after the presentation. But first, I have an immense pleasure to introduce our inaugural speaker, Daniel Levinthal. Dan is a Reginald H. Jones Professor of Corporate Strategy at the Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania. I think it's safe to say that his ideas should be familiar to all scholars of organizations. Dan's research contributed to such areas as organizational adaptation, exploration and exploitation, organizational learning, evolutionary perspective, formal modeling, and, of course, absorptive capacity. And for the latter, together with Wesley Cohen, he has been included on the Clarivate Citation Laureate list in the economic sciences in 2018. And for those who are not familiar with this list, it is the one that each year tries to predict future recipients of the Nobel Prize in economics with quite a decent reliability. The nomination on that list stated that Dan was included on it for the introduction and development of the concept of absorptive capacity and its contribution to our understanding of technological innovation. In 2010, Dan also received a Distinguished Scholar Award granted by the Organizational and Management Theory Division of the Academy of Management for his contributions to our understanding of organizations. Himself a student of late James March, Dan trained many doctoral students who later elaborated and contributed to many of his ideas. And for his mentorship of young scholars, Dan received the Irwin Award as Distinguished Educator by the Business Policy Division of the Academy of Management. For those of us who had the pleasure attending this award ceremony, I think the most striking thing was the generosity of Dan to mentoring young scholars that was often mentioned. Dan is also a very engaged member of the broader academic community. He served as an editor-in-chief of the Strategy Science Journal, a journal that he founded. He also served as editor-in-chief of Organization Science between 2010 and 2013, and as an editor of Industrial and Corporate Change. And I give you Dan Levinthal.
Okay, well, thank you for that very kind introduction, and John and the group for the opportunity to share some ideas and work with you all. John and the team asked us to maybe tap in a bit to a recent book I have, which we believe in cumulative processes, so both builds on prior work and also pushes that work forward a bit. And I'll do that and also try to touch on, I think, some maybe important touchstones. I do appreciate, John, the nice imperialist move. I once wrote a paper, what is not behavioral strategy? So yes, I think our issues as a community are really quite core. So let me start big picture, very big picture, and suggest we have two really fundamental ideas about why things are their way in the world. So as depicted by Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, we have design, whether by a deity or less deity, but still fairly rarefied, the image of choice in neoclassical economics, or this other pole of a Darwinian process, random variance and some selection over it. Two important kind of animating ideas. I think our community lives in the complicated middle. Okay, the poles are well defined. It's easy to characterize them. I can write down clear models, conceptualizations of them. But the behavioral strategy, yes, there's intention, but we're not godlike. And there's a range. So and there's not, I think part of our challenge in community too is we don't have a kind of singular clarity of, what is the canonical model? And so we can have some interesting variation and contestation among ourselves. That range, I have cognitive representation. Okay, it's leaning towards the intentional optimization side. Imitation, well, imitation's a replicator. So it's kind of, a few bit flips away from a Darwinian kind of process. And I think our middle ground is kind of not only, pragmatic, that's where life is. We're hot. Okay, the world has discovered us. We're now living in this kind of age of intentional experimentation. So whether some of that intentional experimentation leans towards rational choice, such as real options, or moving a little bit interior, the random controlled trials and A/B testing. Our current moment of machine learning, I think one can think about machine learning as reinforcement learning with a very healthy dose of steroids. And those steroids include large data sets. They include complicated neural nets, not a sort of single reinforcement learning actor outcome kind of cycle, but the fundamental engine is that. So I think it's really exciting moment. But I think that exciting moment has both, as I note here, a kind of glass half full, half empty quality. So yay team, we're relevant. The world has kind of discovered us. As I know, maybe even a bigger bang on the head on economists than cognitive diversity or the Carnegie School provided. That economists, those engineers at Google and OpenAI, they're pretty clever people with lots of resources. And what are they doing? They're playing with learning algorithms. Maybe there's something there. But as often when indigenous people get discovered, they often get ignored. Okay, so the indigenous community of behavioral scholars actually are not so much part of this conversation, even though we've kind of been living in this continent for a while. So the important alignment problem, this issue of, yes, the feedback in the AI, is that really indicative of the true underlying problem? It's a variant of the myopia of learning that Jim and I talked about a long time ago, the hoping for A, rewarding B problem that those of us in the community have thought about for a while. A hierarchical neural net can be think about as a problem or design. As my friend and occasional collaborator, Finish Prum, would note, this thinking about AI and human actors is a problem of division of labor and coordination. And so it actually, the issues our community has been dealing with over the decades are actually have heightened relevance, whether that's being recognized or not, an important kind of opportunity for us. And I'd point in this regard to Felipe and Tom's interesting annuals piece, this kind of back and forth between artificial intelligence, machine learning, has a very, very ancient history dating from the earliest days of Carnegie Tech. And so they kind of give a nice discussion around that back and forth and take us somewhat to our current moment. So I had these pretty pictures, Michelangelo, with the creation, Darwin. I needed a iconic image for the middle ground, and so for that, I offer up this Mendel. So Mendel, I like as a middle ground figure. So the experiments are intentional. He's consciously messing with his P's. He's not determining the outcome. He's predicting some statistical relationship of what the next generation might look like. So I think he kind of, yeah, as a kind of touchstone, is a possibly interesting touchstone for this middle ground with this intentionality. And one of the things I want to emphasize, though, when we think about experiments, the possibilities are not limitless. There's path dependence or adjacent possible. All plausible experiments are not readily accessible at any moment in time. But experiments, if we think about evolution dynamics, have a nice property, right? That our ideas and initiatives may be mortal, perhaps the entity in which those experiments are housed might have a longer life. So we can have different cycle times around mortality between the entity that is cultivating and going through these experimental processes versus those experiments themselves. Something I'm really going to emphasize in the discussion today is the encoding of outcomes. I think in many treatments of experiments, it's viewed as non-problematic. In many cases, it is. The scientist was looking for a certain chemical reaction. Edison's looking for a filament that works. The sort of outcome may have a sort of well-defined quality. I think in many of our contexts, that's less true. And particularly, I think it's interesting if we think about, say, this current moment of AI and so on, is lots of the experiments, particularly in that context, are in fast feedback operational settings. So you're running your online platform, your Amazon, you vary something about how things are presented and pricing, you're getting immediate feedback that's very indicative and tied to the action you took. What about strategic action? Well, what do we mean by strategic? We typically mean something that's distant in time and may also have broad spatial implications for the organization, right? That is, across units and activities. And in that case, then for strategic action, the feedback's going to be, it's going to have these interpretive challenges. So I think that's really a central kind of issue that I want to tee up in our consideration of learning. A second point I want to emphasize, as noted here, is a lot of our discourse around adaptation and learning, we privilege, and it's clearly important, the variation in alternatives. Okay, is there a rich soup can? I want to also note the importance of the variation in how we evaluate and recognizing both the variation and across time, how those considerations change as being really quite critical. And that obviously fits with this emphasis on the interpretation of experience and selection criteria. So that's kind of a very broad setup. And again, back to this kind of pairing, yes, the intentionality around design in terms of initiative with the important caveat of path dependence. And in contrast to the Darwinian process, nature selects, the organization gets to be a selector, right? Those folks around that boardroom get to decide issues around resource allocation. They design incentive structures and counting schemas that mediate what feedback is occurring from the environment, profit, loss, sales outcomes, and so on, and how that rains onto actors within the organization. So that's this sort of central idea of the, quote, artificial, person-made, constructed, not sort of just there in the external environment. Thinking about the artificial environment causes, I think, in my view, perhaps a reconsideration of a theory of the firm. So Williamson gives us a theory of the firm, very important ideas around when understanding boundaries as a byproduct of when the coordination problem isn't served through contractual arrangements. It's interesting to contrast Williamson with what Sire and March talk about, okay? Sire and March take the firm boundary as given, okay? It's a social fact, okay? These entities exist. Now it's an interesting question to understand how they operate and behave. So Williamson's about boundaries, Sarah and March are about behaviors. But I think it suggests it's a kind of interesting open opportunity and important challenge is from a behavioral side, from an adaptive learning side, what might we have to say about boundaries and how they matter? So I'm not going to give us argument about optimal boundaries. I think that's a really important question from this perspective. I will, yes, they exist, but thinking about the implications from adaptive point of view. And what I argue, as I noted, what's central for me in this argumentation is the firm as a whole receives profit and losses. It gets to choose how those implications rain on actors within it. And I'll tie in a minute to some of early work within the AI tradition around this idea of credit assignment. But as I suggest in this little diagram here, I want to highlight three kind of dimensions by which we might consider this artificial selection environment. So one, unit selection. So I kind of borrowing from some of John's early work, thinking about General Electric. General Electric shifts its organizational structure. It comes up with this idea of a strategic business unit. So the object of selection is being crafted over the years by my named professorship, Reginald Jones, and his successor, Jack Welch, and others. So that's a choice about what we kind of describe, what we want to characterize as the relevant unit. The organization potentially gets to buffer initiatives from immediate selection pressures. I mean, one way to think about it, the venture capitalist doesn't give the entrepreneurs a weekly allowance. Okay, it says, here's some initial round of funding. We'll come back 6 months later and see how things are going. So sort of this temporal divide, and similarly within inside the large corporation. And as I've already kind of noted, again, this selection criteria, immediate profit and losses may not be that indicative of merit. What are the dimensions of merit by which we feel like we're climbing some positive gradient? So I think those are sort of three really central dimensions that I want to draw our attention to. So yes, the organization lives in a world. It lives in a particular part of that world. It lives in particular niches that impose kind of particular intensity of pressures and criteria. I often, draw from Clay Christensen's early work as kind of a really nice touchstone in this regard. Which consumer space are you living in is sending you the cues about what's important. Am I living in the desktop computer space where it's about cost and memory size? Am I in this emergent space of laptop where portability, power consumption, and so on are relevant? So that's raining on the organization. But again, what's the interpretive schema as defined by strategy, coding, selection criteria, that then in turn cascades down onto particular units of analysis within the organization. And the organization is not just these sort of tangible initiatives. The organization, people have viewpoints about strategy, vision, their coalitions and power dynamics. And ultimately, those competing visions and power dynamics might influence strategy. So we kind of have the loop potentially coming back because we have to understand ultimately what are the dynamics of that higher order schema. The artificial selection environment presumably is not static and enduring for all time. Okay, so that's big picture. I'm sorry, one other further element I want to add is these niches are not random controlled trials. Okay, the organization is not randomly assigned. It makes a choice about what niches in which it wants to operate. And in that regard, there's some interesting choices that do I want to leverage my current capabilities and kind of maximal profits, or are there some niches in market spaces I want to operate because I think they might be indicative of where the world's going? So if I'm a retailer in fast fashion or something, or maybe some elements of multi-unit restaurant activity, California might be a really important niche if I feel like that's a precursor where I think the rest of the country might go in a decade. Or if I think the EU and its regulatory schemas might be indicative of where other regulatory schemas might operate, even if it's not maximizing current interest, maybe having a place there and understanding how to operate in that structure will help position the for it. So you may not want to be operating purely in the representative market of today, but potentially the indicative market of tomorrow. And as I note here, a variant of the exploration exploitation trade-off might be underlying some of this choice about niches in which you are choosing to operate. Okay, so with that backdrop, I want to kind of then shift to some more micro level foundational elements, and with that in place, kind of put in some scaffolding, as it were. So kind of our early behavioral to the cognitive to what in the AI literature, these so-called actor-critic models, which are pretty close cousins to when we think about cognitive and adaptive aspirations, but highlighting this distinction between choice and sort of how the model evaluation itself evolves. Okay, so just basic terrain, but have basics in place. A kind of Tolman-esque, yes, we take actions, the mice go left or right, there's some cheese or water, and changing. We don't typically think about the mice having to have a belief structure, maybe it's just proclivity to action, and changing behavior going forward. And then we go from a triangle to a square. That's a big change. It's an important change because we have a new node, which is the interpretive schema. How did that cheese feel to you? Was it really tasty and worth going left? Maybe there's tasty cheese on the right. How do I now evaluate behavior going forward? So with Simon, we have this kind of fixed binary encoding. Clearly, the idea of adaptive aspirations. What should I aspire? Where should this breakpoint be? And how that might change through experience, a central part in the behavioral tradition. And, last decade or so, a lot of interesting discourse. Well, the encoding scheme is even further problematized. In fact, we have multiple goals. I want the cheese to taste well, but does it spread on my baguette? There might a lot of considerations be involved, and there may be some power dynamics around how that those considerations play out. So I think we can kind of anchor, this sort of basic primitive diagram, some of the sort of tradition and arc of discourse within the field. And as I kind of noted, the actor-critic model. So I did this early work with Christina and Yerker, and it struck me, yes, we have this iconic, the teammates, you go left or right, we get reward. But if I'm looking for imagery, I actually, it's not a tease, it's a more complicated maze. And when in a more complicated maze, you go left or right. We had a meeting, we had an offsite, we have a prototype that sort of works. Are we moving towards our goal? It's not so obvious, right? So in this kind of British garden maze, am I moving to the center when I kind of gonna, walk this way? Not so clear. Is it a dead end? And I think our managerial actions have more of that quality than the Tolman-esque left-right team maze. So how do you make progress in this very complicated structure where I don't get the helicopter views of a maze? I'm an actor in real time navigating it. Well, there's some really early work in AI by Samuels that I kind of always struck me as interesting, and my window into it was this important work by John Holland. And as a kind of intellectual footnote, so this book by Michael Cohen was a dear friend and colleague of Holland in Michigan. Michael takes a sabbatical to Stanford, and I was grateful in the early 80s to be overlapping. And he assigned me to read Holland. And I'm quite certain that he assigned Professor March to read Holland. Holland tees up the exploration exploitation trade-off and actually look at the first paragraph or second paragraph in Jim's iconic 91 paper. He makes that intellectual kind of docking there. But back to Samuels. So Samuels is 1959. He's working IBM. They have the best computers, but it's 1959. He's interested in machine learning. He's not dreaming about playing chess. It's a lower task environment. How do you make this machine play checkers? But he has this kind of important insight. It's like, there's not immediate feedback. So you move your piece to this other red square, black square, maybe you capture somebody else's piece. Are you moving forward? It's more this kind of maze-like thing. And he has this interesting insight. He said, well, how about, so the world's not giving me feedback. It's not a win-loss is not giving me useful feedback. That's too distant in time. So how about if the algorithm develops a belief structure? And if I move to a position that I believe in my cognitive schema, as it were, is valuable, that will reward the action. So there's no tangible word from the outside. And so the machine learns, I don't play checkers, but apparently controlling the center of the board is important. So states in which your pieces are in the center of the board become more valuable through this machine learning process. This idea of credit assignment becomes kind of essential in Holland's work. In the more contemporary AI literature, important book by Sutton and Bardo kind of appears as well. And as I term it here, I kind of think about it as dynamic programming for behaviorals. So you may be for a Bellman and this sort of rational choice. The problem with the Bellman dynamic programming is that only works well when the state space is relatively small and bounded, and you can sort of unfold backward from the known possible outcomes to the actions I take today. In these open-ended structures, it's not so useful. So V is a belief structure. It's not a true statement. And Sid Winter had this early, lovely kind of suggestive essay. And he talks about this in that piece as a kind of a book chapter as an imputation problem. So again, this is a formalized way of thinking about your cognitive schema and how that influences and reward action. Pi is the immediate output. That's what the world is telling you, but that not may be very indicative in a multi-step kind of problem. So how do we get through the maze? Well, we're climbing these kind of castles in the sky, as it were, right? So the gradient is given by my schema. So how does the organization know it's making progress? How do we know the offsite was good or this initial prototype is good? We have some schema that says, oh, I think moving ahead on these functionality gradients is progress. And so I'm going to give a pat on the back to the product development team. We've met our milestone. Well, a milestone is a actor social construction. It's not the environment saying you did something. It's saying by our schema, we think we're climbing the right gradient. So I think it's a really interesting, always talking mapping between this kind of credit assignment ideas and these kind of schemas and structures within organizations. Okay, so big picture setup. What I want to spend the bulk of the time is thinking about this issue of, okay, how do we know what is good? How do we evaluate outcomes? And kind of with this outline in mind, go through. Suspecting context specific, maybe a triage for time purposes, but hope to make it through the other key parts of the outline. So off the diving board or the cliff into our deeper dive. So today, Giovanni and I, this on and offline ideas. So how do we know something's good? John wants to fly from LA to New York. You open up the web browser and you see the options, the price, the timing. You actually don't have to fly from LA to New York to decide which idea is good. Very efficiently, you can evaluate those alternatives offline. How do I know this new manufacturing process is good? Maybe I actually have to do it. How do I know, in fact, how people will respond to this new product or service? At least in some ways, maybe I have to put it out in the world. So that's the race. Competition, the environment has to give you feedback. There's another kind of issue, which is actually sort of central to most work on experiments. What doesn't think about offline is the direct cost of testing. So you're running a lab. Mice may live or die. I have to buy them. I have to run things. So there's some expenses, but the important thing is you're not putting the enterprise at risk. We're spending money, but we're not. What I think the critical issue is, and I think underappreciated, is underlying the exploration and exploitation trade-off is a notion of opportunity cost. I forego some product or service, or my stylized bandit model that I and some folks play with is I'm not picking RMI, I'm picking J. When I pick J, I am foregoing I. That's an opportunity cost. That is not running a lab experiment where we still offer our same product and services to our current customers. So Pfizer is still offering its current medicines to people and pharmaceutical products when it runs its lab experiments. It doesn't have to pull those from the market. So there's really, we can think about kind of classic experimentation. It can be offline and costless, like the right airline to pick, or actually maybe non-trivial costs. But those are direct costs, not opportunity costs. I think that's a somewhat underappreciated but rather important kind of distinction. So back in the day when Giovanni and we had this working draft, my then colleague Gabriel Zelansky made a really interesting observation to us, like, okay, nice paper, but you might make this distinction, but it can change as our theories and understanding of action-outcome relationship change. It changes. And I said, yeah, Gabriel, that's a great idea. And so even in that original paper, we offer this idea of the development of airframes. So the Wright brothers, how do you test things back in those days? You build it. And some people died building constructions that didn't work. Early versions of the Wright brothers, they didn't die, but they did have some crashes. So those are high-cost online trials. As we understand collectively aerodynamics better, it's more of a direct cost thing. We got to build this toy little plane. It's not trivial building it to scale. We have this thing called small scale wind tunnel. We check it out, the aerodynamics. And in the contemporary days, for better Airbus and Boeing, we can just go offline. We have computer simulation. Now, as we move through this arc, obviously, there's the question of, well, how good are our models of the world? Okay, so is this kind of computational model really capturing the aerodynamics and all the issues around that or not? But I think it's an important point of sort of, there often can be as theories in a way that fits the broader schema. As your theories and understanding changes, what is on and offline may not be kind of a fixed property. Okay, timing. I've already alluded to it a little bit. We have this external world. We have stuff percolating in the organization. The external world itself varies in timing. So product markets tend to be myopic. You're buying the smartphone that you like. From Samsung, Google, Apple, whoever, that is a contemporaneous evaluation of product offerings today. Financial markets, yes, they're looking ahead. Recent graduates from our MBA programs are looking at various indicators and making projections and creating models and playing with spreadsheets that make some forward-looking forecasts, but conditional on observables. And as I note, the artificial selection environment, the organization is this kind of interesting temporal bridge. Does it buffer initiatives, activities from the immediate cues from the environment or not? And that buffering in some sense creates space for strategic action. It also creates space for organizations potentially be very decoupled from their environment. So it's not intrinsically good or bad, but that's the space in some sense that the artificial selection environment offers from our kind of pure Darwinian sorts of image. And I think it's interesting to note, kind of really work hard I did is this kind of early on initiatives are both most vulnerable to what the world might offer and pose, and most plastic. So we think about the biological species vary, but humans spend a lot of time protecting their young from we don't put new babies out in the forest and see how they do. We protect them, give them lots of a kind of constructed niche space of family to allow them to percolate and grow. And at some level, organizations do that with initiatives as well. But again, this problem, okay, but how are things going? How informative are contemporary measures? We don't want to let things go on forever in terms of initiatives. We might want children to go. They'll eventually get off the couch and enter the external world as well. But this kind of selectability challenge is ultimately still present. And just quickly note, back to the sort of spirit of problematizing. So yes, the idea of options and real options are an important construct, but as Ron and I note, I think a lot of our discourse, early on discourse, certainly, and still some, tends to somewhat cartoon image of this. And that is, in a financial option, we don't have to evaluate kind of where we are in the stage 2. You bought a bunch of options on NVIDIA, you're in the money or not, that's well defined. When you make early stage bets in a corporation, where you are 6 months, 18 months down the road is likely to be ambiguous. You've likely gotten mixed feedback. What happens is an exogenous is a function of effort and as well as the intrinsic value. Exiting is not necessarily an easy thing, as well as the cues you get around that are not easy. So I think it's really important that we have kind of, again, problematizing the selection process. I think is really quite important. And that speaks to the sort of big bucket of considerations I have here under criteria. Okay, and let me kind of walk us through or run through some of these kinds of considerations. So yes, we understand the exploration exploitation trade-off. It's important, but to some degree, I want to kind of open up like how we think about that. And in particular, we tend to think about it as the space of actions. We've never had this kind of alliance before. We never invested this kind of technology. But we can also, in some sense, be divergent, not just in our space of action, but how we evaluate that action. What are the dimensions of merit? And so here we have this kind of socially agreed upon in the organization, dimensions of merit. There's other possible dimensions of merit. And so we can be local or distant, not just in the action space, but thinking about what we're doing from a new lens. Let's think about the disk drive from the perspective of laptop people, not desktop, okay? That wasn't a big shift in the space of action. It's a big shift from the performance metrics by which we evaluate action. So this kind of, Ron and I talked about sort of, the actor behavior in terms of, so the perception of it look exploratory because you don't think what their dimensions of merit they're climbing are relevant or not. And that makes it raises some interesting challenges on how you validate action. So Ron brought this sort of lovely allegory of flatlands, or somebody who lives in 2 dimensions, tries to explain to others, the protagonist tries to say there's actually a 3rd dimension, and it doesn't work out so well for them. And there's a variety of ways. One way, I think, early work by Bergman was quite lovely. So the people doing the risk chip within Intel, they don't try to validate the risk chips in its own terms. They say it can do things for the things you care about. It casts shadows on the flat land of the current organizational strategies and metrics. Maybe there are other cues about the merit of this novel dimension. But it's important to note, and Jim's favorite book, Don Quixote, this sort of fine line between are you a visionary, or are you delusional? Okay, and right, so being divergent kind of raises both possibilities. And then when we think about organizational change, we have this kind of, what I want to suggest is the shift in selection environment really underlies punctuation. I think this sort of metamorphosis view that we've had in the literature, I don't think is really quite what's going on. And what I want to suggest is more shifting the selection criteria creates a kind of, whether in technology is a speciation event, or some recent work with Don Mee, a kind of shift in firm strategy and in term selection. Going from a 49% power to 51 is a discontinuity in kind of political power. Okay. So again, we've Cantor, we have this idea about variety of initiatives and so on. Cantor's imagery of 1,000 is sort of a 10x increase from Mao's famous quote about 100 flowers. But if we think about that context, it's kind of interesting. So in 56, there's come forth with your ideas. In 57, there's a rather strong reaction to some of those divergent ideas. And so what I would suggest, again, instead of just not worrying about the number of flowers, if we only have one type of lawnmower, you're not going to get heterogeneity down the road. If we don't have heterogeneity in our selection processes, you're going to squash the heterogeneity that might be emergent. And that's a challenge for a hierarchical organization. So the organization may have the resources to make multiple bets. Can it be multiple lines? Well, that's part of what some organizational structures do. I allocate capital to this unit and let them make choices. I give 20% of my employees discretionary time to make their choices. So I've restricted myself as a higher level actor from imposing my vision onto others. But that ultimately delays, it doesn't eliminate the ultimate need for higher level evaluation. Okay, so by racing, to create some space here, so I want to give some time for the broader discussion, context-specific feedback. So as I noted, one important context is where you choose to compete. Ko et al., kind of a nice example, who I asked. Did I ask women? Do I ask men? Gives a very different indication of the perceived value of a new initiative and how that cues up are the signals we might have. More broadly, so we're, interesting moment, a lot of interest around random controlled trials and such. I think it's important to distinguish between the search for general truth, okay, the RCT to partial out all context effects, versus some version of A/B trial, which I would view as essentially local hill climbing. The organization is doing A. How about we do a one-bit flip and do B? And it's better or worse for us. That's not a statement about universal truth. It's saying where we are in this landscape means this one bit is better. And so I really think the important part is, are we partialing out to this aspiration for a universal, or are we running local experiments to move our organization forward? Reinforcement learning, that's kind of, I'm not just me in the world, it's me and my colleagues in the organization. Well, that's called routines, how mutual adaptation takes place. If we think about, as I'm inclined, NK landscapes and the like, so we have these interdependent systems, if there are some context effect, looking at the best in the world vis-a-vis a particular processing and so on, unless I assume it's a K=0 world, is going to be problematic. So I may not want to copy the best. I want to maybe copy the good similar. In that sense, intra-organizational learning, not necessarily population learning, is really interesting because culture and other things are going to be a common context for actors and units inside that organization. And so the organization becomes this powerful way of population learning as is in a organization, intra-organizational population. So this kind of homophily in organizations as useful boundary objects in imitative processes, perhaps silly, but we think about recombination, and yes, that's really important. But from the biological point, I would just note, yes, higher order species, you can have asexual reproduction. They tend to be lower order species that are being a little evaluative. But sexual, this is not a random, web-enabled hookup, okay? This is occurring with species. Well, species are boundary objects. This is, again, a high dose of homophily in terms of recombination, taking things forward. So in closing, yes, we can think about adaptation, Schumpeter at the kind of population levels. We can think about, and so I think it's interesting to think about the intra-population ecology, this collating amplification. I think it's also interesting to contrast the lean startup with the corporation. I think the corporation can have a certain kind of rise. I think it struggles with the recontracting problem. I think in the lean startup, there's sort of this transparency of action to those people in the boardroom who allocate these resources, the VCs and so on, see what's going on in a multi-level hierarchical organization. This redirecting, recontracting, I think, is an interesting challenge that may partly part of the sort of inertia challenges. So we can have either you adapt through variation selection, or the individual initiative changes. And I would suggest in the lean startup, you have in the limit a single initiative that pivots. The organization can have plurality and maybe call that polarity, and potentially individual initiatives as well. I think there's an interesting contrast and trade-off there. And my final observation before we kind of open it up, a kind of broader sort of meta observation. Units of analysis matter. Organizations are complex adaptive systems. So one thing I often like to note and sort of pull from Jim's important 91 piece is, I use it as an exemplar of this kind of issue, is it can be very challenging to go from the individual attribute, say in his case, the speed of individual learning, and is this good or bad for the organization? And I just want to put that out as a cautionary note. So I think, yes, I'm supportive of the dynamic capability broad agenda, but I think it's very careful to kind of, ultimately we're interested in adaptive organizations. and this mapping between individual attributes and that macro quality, there can be some distance, and it may not always be so obvious. That kind of indicators of rapid learning at one level may not be supportive of the aggregate engaging in useful adaptive learning. Kind of make a pitch for this multi-level consideration. But you know, again, just as it was close, I mean, some broad observations on a kind of interesting journey for me, and interested in your thoughts about how we push that journey forward. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. I think it's a great testament to our profession that we never stop learning. And this kind of feels like a big kind of doctoral class again. So thank you so much, Dan, for this. So let me maybe start with kind of a question to your book that was recently released. So here is a question that kind of asks about the Lamarckian perspective. So, you know, there's this one idea between the Darwinian and Lamarckian. Lamarckian being you can adapt, Darwinian you're being selected upon, you have zero kind of agency. How does the Lamarckian kind of fit into your schema between kind of, you know, this Darwinian versus rational agent?
Yeah. So it's interesting, important kind of conceptual issue. So first, I sort of start off kind of in an intro, actually, which Sid approved of. So I sort of feel good because I kind of make first I said, I think from the evolutionary economic point of view, right, they start with the gene. And I think that might, I critique Sid and Dick a little bit by saying they don't distinguish between gene and phenotype. So yes, we have this genetic encoding, but then I get water, I get fertilizer, and I grow to a bigger or smaller plant. The world operates on the phenotype. So that's one sort of important observation. Furthermore, and again, so I just say, look, from an evolutionary point of view, I don't need the gene, I don't need the strong, I need path dependence. So the path dependence is enough for my argument. I anchor on path. And so for Lamarckian, we've created structures, we've created ideas, we've created culture. That's a starting point going forward. So I wouldn't necessarily say I'm being Lamarckian, but it has more of that quality where what is built and constructed, as it were, doesn't disappear. I want to push away from this kind of there's a new generation. And so actually my intellectual starting point is say, let's lose the gene, keep path dependence. And so I am more pushing away from that contrast, but in some sense, some of that Lamarckian sensibility, as it were, gets in. So yeah, path dependence is sufficient. And so all the affordances we created in T are relevant for T+1.
Okay, thank you very much. And by the way, there was a question from Mario Shirjan. And so kind of related to this, I'm going to go immediately kind of because it speaks to the same kind of answer. So from Gwendolyn Lee. So Dan, I greatly appreciate the 3 dimensions you pose, unit, level of analysis, and selection criteria and timing. Could you use this framework to explain how feature phone makers missed the opportunity to develop smartphones? What is a unique explanation drawn from the perspective of the Mendelian executive?
Yeah, so that's dangerous. And there's John on the call who has rather deep knowledge of this context. So I'll cheat and start with my conceptual schema and allow people to know context more about to fill in. So, you know, one issue is path dependence is not irrelevant. Okay, the complementary assets I have are strongly suggestive of what look like interesting adjacent possibles. You know, the established firm, Nokia, Motorola are different. So, and actually, they shouldn't act like startups, right? You want to have something. Brian Wu and Wan have a paper in SMJ, like, you know, how you have beliefs, but I have complementary resources that are going to change my point of view about action versus, say, a clean slate startup who parachutes in. So what looks like appealing adjacent possible, and, you know, what are the what's the niche space in which I'm operating? Who are my current users? What are their performance suggestions? So I guess my suggestion is, my bet is, my hypothesis is, the sort of what looks like the appealing adjacent possible in terms of the existing resource-based path dependence and vis-a-vis our current schema and understanding about
Okay.
I mean, I think also like Apple is another side. Something Ron Adler points out in his work. I mean, Apple starts out with the device that you're holding that plays music. And then there's a sort of 1-bit flip that says, oh, we'll add cellular onto this. It becomes kind of a phone. So I mean, they have a particular starting point. It was actually a platform as a music device before it became. So they were kind of very well situated to think about the device as a multifunction thing. They were in a platform business, as it were, with iTunes before that device became a phone. And so back to this kind of path dependence and the sort of schemas you have, I think might speak interestingly to that really interesting question.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Another question is from Peter Campo. So the foundation of Holland's theory and the foundation of complex adaptive systems is the concept of action at micro levels leads to emergence in macro levels. So how does this figure in your model?
Yeah, so thank you. I mean, that's sort of, and put maybe more nicely and explicitly, kind of my final slide, my pitch is that it's important to think about these as, and again, whether a verbal theorist of model, the empiricist sort of as a multi-level system, and that's hard. It's important, but it's quite important. So yes, that's kind of central, and I think in that spirit, then in ways that are somewhat complex. So there's the external environment. We have this artificial selection environment, and under the hood of that is we have some ecology of actions, initiatives, and actors within. So in my stylized schema, it's kind of a 3-level system. But yes, that's absolutely quite central. This kind of what are the micro, and one can always what's the micro foundation? We can always have to go to the neurological level. I mean, what is the useful micro unit of analysis? In part, the question you're asking, the theoretical structure you're trying to build. But yes, there should be a macro, a micro, and a macro, and sort of understanding and speculating a bit about the linkages between those levels.
Right. So here's another question from Mario Shijvan. And this it takes us back to really kind of like a doctoral class sort of a vibes here. So many people say or equate exploration and exploitation with local search and distance search. Are they really the same, or can we sort of think about them as somewhat independent constructs?
Yeah, so we can think about it broadly. So yes, I think, and naturally, empirically, that's how a lot of the work operates. Is the space of action different? If you think about some of the modeling, say some of the modeling you do, like a bandit model, it's actually, there's not a spatial correlation structure. So the landscape has spatial correlation. In my belief schema, I think I is a really awesome idea. I think J is kind of interesting, but as of this moment, less options. So distance is in your cognitive schema, and that's vis-a-vis belief. And what what sort of Ron and I try to introduce is another angle there is in my evaluation, schema. Imagine in some ways the work that Felipe and I did as a SFJ piece of you might weight different dimensions of performance. And so I put a lot of weight on this functionality, less on this other. And so sort of how distant it is in my weighting scheme from a different weighting scheme. So we have a space of action, we have a space of belief, and we have a kind of criteria space. And I think we can think about local and distant in all of those. I think and sort of, right. So I offer up that kind of multiple perspectives on that question.
Thank you. I think we have a time for one more question. So you kind of sketched out a little bit this sort of idea of experimentation and adaptation when it comes to strategic decisions, which are usually big, kind of we don't make them too often. Very often we have very little to compare them to. So to what extent do you see experimentation possible in the space of strategic actions or exploring different business models?
Yeah, exactly. As you tee up, right? It is challenge. I mean, the sort of the low-hanging fruit of experimentation is sort of the operational and tactics. So how do we think about experiments? And there are a variety of approaches. So part of my early interest in analogical reasoning was, well, even if the world's new, are there trace indicators from past environments, right? So I don't have to directly experience. I can draw on some catalog of prior histories and related histories to try to make inferences. I think along those lines, some of the work I do with Jiao Chow, category schemas. So at one level of granularity, life is a series of unique events. If I treat life in that way, there's no basis for learning. I cry, I go home, I get locked up in an insane asylum. So we have category schemas that allow us to sort of generalize, which is, so analogical reasoning is going from point to point. Category schema offers one more, but this issue of sort of more distant things, I think that's where the credit assignment scheme becomes really important. So we have to develop beliefs around intermediate signals. The ultimate, moving this checker piece doesn't give me a win and loss. Do I believe it is stage setting? Does my theory of my belief valuation schema that I developed suggest it's stage setting? And so I see, that's why I feel those kinds of issues are so critical. Now, it also may be, maybe I can enter niche spaces that may give me faster feedback. That's where the sort of, this niche space, it may not be high volume, but the folks in Southern California or NASA might pose interesting early challenges that might become representative. And so I can sort of I can compress a little bit that time. But I think, yes, you're absolutely right, that's really enormous challenge. And I think in the AI moment, right, it's kind of interesting, how far up the food chain can this go from operational to strategic, as you suggest, is things that are more distant in time and space from that action. So I think they're imperfect ways, but I thought that's really a fascinating key challenge, right, kind of going forward.
Great. Well, so thank you very much, all of you who posted questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them, but I think it's time. We've spent a wonderful 1 hour with Dan. So, John, I'm gonna hand it over to you for a few last words.
First of all, just a big thank you to Dan Levinthal for taking us through a fascinating look at the subject of adaptation for our first masterclass. So Dan, thank you. I'm sure we see the claps going up. Maciej, thank you for a great job as our moderator. A big thanks to SMS for helping us put on this webinar. And on behalf of the entire behavioral strategy IG leadership team, we look forward to seeing you in Istanbul. Thank you.